On the afternoon of April 9th, 1865, as word spread through the Union encampments that Robert E. Lee had signed the surrender documents in a parlor at Appomattox Courthouse, the Federal artillery began to fire salutes. The explosions carried across the Virginia countryside in the way that cannon fire does felt as much as heard, vibrating through the ground and the chest, unmistakable in what they announce. The gunners were celebrating the end of 4 years. Grant had the fire stopped before it could properly build. The order that passed down the chain of command was brief and direct. The men in gray were their countrymen again, and there would be no triumphant noise discharged over what had just taken place in McLean's parlor. The war was over. The guns could wait. The decision to silence the artillery took no time and said everything about the man who made it. It was not a sentimental gesture. Grant was not a sentimental man, at least not in any conventional expression of the word. It was a considered judgment about what the next 24 hours and the next 24 years required from the person holding the position he held. And it was one of the things James Longstreet carried with him for the rest of his life, not as an abstract historical moment, but as something close and specific, tied to a friendship that had been built long before the first shot of the war was fired and that endured through the 4 years both men spent trying to defeat each other. Longstreet and Grant had known each other for the better part of 2 decades by the time the war ended. Their acquaintance began at West Point in the early 1840s, where Grant was remembered not for academic distinction. He finished in the middle of his class, but for horsemanship that was exceptional, and for a quietness that fellow cadets read as shyness or self-containment, depending on how well they knew him. Longstreet was a year ahead. They moved through the compressed social world that the antebellum officer corps produced, the same garrison posts, the same mess halls, the same slow rotations of men who had been trained together and had no civilian alternative to each other's company. In 1848, when Ulysses Grant married Julia Dent, Longstreet stood as a groomsman. This was not a courtesy extended to a social acquaintance. Julia Dent and Longstreet were cousins connected by the Southern family ties that structured antebellum social life, and his presence at the wedding wove him into Grant's private history in a way that years of separation could not dissolve. He was present at the start of the central relationship of Grant's life. The decade that followed was difficult for Grant in ways it was not for Longstreet. Farming attempts in Missouri failed. Business ventures failed. Financial hardship left him by the end of the 1850s, working in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois. With the military career West Point had prepared him for apparently finished. Longstreet, still in active service and managing his affairs with more success, was among the men from the old professional world who helped Grant during those years. The precise details of what passed between them privately are not fully documented. Men of their generation were not inclined to write openly about financial assistance between friends, but that Longstreet provided some support during Grant's lean period is part of what both men acknowledged afterward. With the terseness of people for whom discussing such things at length felt unnecessary. By the spring of 1861, they had been friends for 20 years through West Point, through Mexico, through a wedding, through the long stretches of peacetime service that defined most of a 19th century military career. What broke them apart in April of that year was not any personal falling out. It was secession, which is to say it was the same fracture that split the officer corps of the United States Army and sent roughly a third of its experienced officers south to fight under a different flag. Longstreet resigned and went to Virginia, where he eventually became the most dependable of Robert E. Lee's corps commanders. Lee referred to him as his old war horse, an affectionate phrase that carried the full meaning of what Lee valued most in a subordinate, which was reliability in the conditions where reliability was hardest to maintain. At Fredericksburg, Longstreet's corps inflicted staggering losses on Union infantry, attacking prepared positions. At Second Bull Run, his assault broke John Pope's army at its weakest point. At Chickamauga in September of 1863, his corps struck a gap in the Union line with a force that shattered the Army of the Cumberland and produced the worst Union defeat of the Western War. Longstreet was not by nature an aggressive commander. He believed in choosing ground deliberately, fortifying it, and compelling the enemy to attack into disadvantages of their own creation. This philosophy made increasing sense as Confederate manpower dwindled past comfortable replacement, and it put him in regular tension with Lee's willingness to strike offensively when the operational picture seemed to offer opportunity. At Gettysburg in July of 1863, Longstreet argued forcefully against the assault on the Union Center that became Pickett's charge. Lee overruled him. When the charge ended in catastrophic Confederate losses with nothing gained, Longstreet had the particular misfortune of having been correct in his objection before witnesses. That fact would not stay dormant. In May of 1864, in the dense woodland south of the Rapidan River, Longstreet was shot by his own men in a friendly fire incident almost identical to the one that had killed Stonewall Jackson at Chancellorsville 13 months earlier. He lost significant function in his right arm and was out of the war for months. He returned to command in time for the final stages of the Petersburg siege, and he was with Lee through the retreat that ended at Appomattox. On the morning of April 9th, he was among the senior Confederate officers present when Lee made the decision that the preceding week of fighting and marching had made unavoidable for anyone reading the situation honestly. The surrender meeting between Lee and Grant took place in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. McLean occupied a specific position in the war's geography. He had owned property near Manassas when the First Battle of Bull Run was fought across it in July of 1861, and he had moved his family south to Appomattox specifically to escape the conflict. It found him anyway. Grant arrived without ceremony, wearing a private soldier's coat marked with a lieutenant general's insignia, his boots still carrying the mud of the roads from the previous day. He had not stopped to change or had not considered it the point. Lee was in full-dress uniform with a sword, immaculate, presenting himself with the care of a man who understood that the visual record of this particular moment would outlast every other record available to him. The contrast between them was stark enough that every officer present noted it in their accounts. What Grant offered in that parlor bore no resemblance to what 4 years of war had trained anyone to expect. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms. Enlisted men who owned horses could take them home. Grant had thought through the spring planting, had recognized that the ability to farm in the coming weeks mattered more to these men's futures than the symbolic question of whether they walked home with their animals. The entire Confederate force would be paroled on the spot, not marched into prisoner of war camps, not transported north under guard, but sent home under the condition that they lay down arms against the United States. Grant also noticed that Lee's men were starving, and he arranged for Union supply wagons to feed them before they dispersed. None of these specific provisions were dictated to him from Washington. Grant had been given latitude in the negotiations, but the particular shape of the terms, the ones that treated Confederate soldiers as men going home rather than enemies being processed into captivity, was his own judgment about what the peace required. He had decided in the hours leading to McLean's parlor that the post-war country needed reconciliation more than it needed a visible punishment of Confederate military personnel, and he was using the complete authority that total military victory gave him to impose that judgment before political pressures in Washington could refine it into something different. Then he stepped outside and stopped the guns. In the hours following the signing, Grant moved through the Confederate lines with the particular awareness of a man who had spent 20 years in the same professional world as the officers on the other side. These were not strangers. The senior generals of both armies had trained at West Point, fought together in Mexico, shared the grinding antebellum routines of men who spent their careers waiting for a war. 4 years of combat had not erased those relationships. It had suspended them under an enormous weight that was now, at least partially, lifted. Longstreet was somewhere in the Confederate encampment when Grant came to find him specifically. The meeting is recorded in Longstreet's Memoirs and confirmed by officers who were in proximity. Grant greeted him using the nickname from the years before the war. Pete and they talked in the way of men who have known each other long enough that the absence of years collapses on contact rather than requiring acknowledgement. They had not spoken since 1861. The 4 years between had been spent in command of forces working to destroy each other. What passed between them in that conversation existed outside the formality of what had just been signed indoors. The surrender meeting between Lee and Grant took place in the parlor of Wilmer McLean's house in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. McLean occupied a specific position in the war's geography. He had owned property near Manassas when the First Battle of Bull Run was fought across it in July of 1861, and he had moved his family south to Appomattox specifically to escape the conflict. It found him anyway. Grant arrived without ceremony, wearing a private soldier's coat marked with a lieutenant general's insignia, his boots still carrying the mud of the roads from the previous day. He had not stopped to change or had not considered it the point. Lee was in full-dress uniform with a sword, immaculate, presenting himself with the care of a man who understood that the visual record of this particular moment would outlast every other record available to him. The contrast between them was stark enough that every officer present noted it in their accounts. What Grant offered in that parlor bore no resemblance to what 4 years of war had trained anyone to expect. Confederate officers could keep their sidearms. Enlisted men who owned horses could take them home. Grant had thought through the spring planting, had recognized that the ability to farm in the coming weeks mattered more to these men's futures than the symbolic question of whether they walked home with their animals. The entire Confederate force would be paroled on the spot, not marched into prisoner of war camps, not transported north under guard, but sent home under the condition that they lay down arms against the United States. Grant also noticed that Lee's men were starving, and he arranged for Union supply wagons to feed them before they dispersed. None of these specific provisions were dictated to him from Washington. Grant had been given latitude in the negotiations, but the particular shape of the terms, the ones that treated Confederate soldiers as men going home rather than enemies being processed into captivity, was his own judgment about what the peace required. He had decided in the hours leading to McLean's parlor that the post-war country needed reconciliation more than it needed a visible punishment of Confederate military personnel, and he was using the complete authority that total military victory gave him to impose that judgment before political pressures in Washington could refine it into something different. Then he stepped outside and stopped the guns. In the hours following the signing, Grant moved through the Confederate lines with the particular awareness of a man who had spent 20 years in the same professional world as the officers on the other side. These were not strangers. The senior generals of both armies had trained at West Point, fought together in Mexico, shared the grinding antebellum routines of men who spent their careers waiting for a war. 4 years of combat had not erased those relationships. It had suspended them under an enormous weight that was now, at least partially, lifted. Longstreet was somewhere in the Confederate encampment when Grant came to find him specifically. The meeting is recorded in Longstreet's Memoirs and confirmed by officers who were in proximity. Grant greeted him using the nickname from the years before the war. Pete and they talked in the way of men who have known each other long enough that the absence of years collapses on contact rather than requiring acknowledgement. They had not spoken since 1861. The 4 years between had been spent in command of forces working to destroy each other. What passed between them in that conversation existed outside the formality of what had just been signed indoors. Grant offered Longstreet money. The offer was direct, practical, and without ceremony. Grant understood Longstreet's situation clearly. As a former Confederate general, he would go home without pay, without pension, without the income that 20 years of federal military service had provided. He was 50 years old with no civilian career and no financial reserves. Grant had lived a version of this exact predicament himself in the 1850s, without income or prospects, dependent on help from people with resources he lacked. He recognized it in Longstreet with the precision of personal experience and made the offer he could make. Longstreet declined. The offer itself was the thing he remembered. It was the thing because it was made in person on the day the war ended, before the post-war political landscape had formed into the shapes that would make such acts complicated. Grant did not calculate how helping Longstreet would read to various constituencies. He did not wait for circumstances to clarify. He saw a friend in a hard position and offered what he had. Longstreet wrote about this in his memoirs decades afterward, with the precision of a man who had revisited the memory many times and wanted the historical record to contain it accurately. The paroles Grant had issued at Appomattox were not merely symbolic documents. They were formal instruments of the United States government, issued with the authority of the commanding general, carrying the specific legal implication that Confederate officers who had signed them had surrendered under terms the government was bound to honor. Grant knew that the post-war period would produce organized political pressure to arrest and prosecute senior Confederate leaders for treason. The pressure was real. It had identifiable advocates in Lincoln's cabinet and in Congress, and it was not without its own reasoning about what justice required after a rebellion built on slavery. When efforts arose to arrest and try Confederate officers, Grant pressed the argument that the parole terms were binding on the government. He communicated to the administration, in terms that left no room for interpretation, that he would resign his commission before he permitted the prosecution of men who had surrendered under the conditions he had offered at Appomattox. He was not negotiating. The administration understood this, and the prosecutions did not proceed. This protection had concrete and immediate value for Longstreet and for every other senior Confederate officer who had signed his parole. The legal uncertainty of the post-war period was real enough that the absence of this floor could have produced very different outcomes for men with his profile. Grant's insistence on the terms he had dictated was an act that cost him politically with the more aggressive wing of his own party, and he absorbed that cost without apparent revision. In the months following the war, Longstreet did something that surprised virtually everyone who knew him and permanently alienated most of his former comrades in the Confederate officer corps. He moved to New Orleans, entered the insurance business, and publicly aligned himself with the Republican Party. He endorsed the constitutional amendments extending citizenship and civil rights to the formerly enslaved. He urged former Confederates to accept the outcome of the war, take the loyalty oath, and participate in rebuilding the country rather than resist Reconstruction's terms. In 1868, he voted for Ulysses Grant. He said these things publicly. He wrote them in letters he gave to newspapers. He knew exactly what he was choosing. In the political geography of the post-war South, becoming a Republican was not simply a change of party affiliation. The Democratic Party in that region was the party of redemption, the organized effort to restore democratic governance, dismantle Reconstruction's civil rights framework, and reestablish the racial and social hierarchy that secession had been designed to protect. To identify with the Republicans was to place yourself in active and public opposition to that project and to the social consensus that enforced it through every available mechanism, formal and informal. Former Confederate generals occupied symbolic positions in this landscape that private citizens did not. Their public statements carried institutional weight. A Republican former Confederate general was a specific kind of political problem for the movement building in the South, and Longstreet's public alignment with Grant and with Reconstruction made him not just an apostate, but a useful target. The weapon used against him had been manufactured from the wreckage of Gettysburg. The lost cause was not a formal organization or a single coordinated argument. It was a convergence of effort among former Confederate officers, politicians, and writers who needed to explain Confederate defeat in terms that preserved the dignity of the men who had fought and the reputations of the men who had led. The central claim was that the Confederacy had not been outfought, but overwhelmed by Northern numbers, by industrial capacity, by material advantages that no generalship could have overcome. The Confederate soldier had been outstanding. Confederate leadership had been sound. Defeat had been structural rather than personal. This argument required that Lee's reputation remain unimpeachable, which meant that the critical failures of the war could not be attached to his decisions. If Lee's generalship had been strategically correct and a trusted subordinate had failed him at the decisive moment, then the loss could be attributed to a single human failure rather than to the broader limitations of Confederate strategy and resources. Jubal Early, who had commanded a corps under Lee and carried a specific personal antagonism toward Longstreet, became the primary voice of what followed. Through the Southern Historical Society and a sustained campaign of letters, speeches, and published articles extending across 2 decades, Early and his allies built the case that Longstreet had lost Gettysburg through willful disobedience, that his argumentative resistance to Lee's orders on the second day, his delays, his reluctant execution of the attack plan, had allowed the Union Army to consolidate the positions that made Pickett's charge necessary and inevitable. The historical scaffolding beneath this argument was thin enough that careful scholarship would spend the next century dismantling it, but it did not need to be historically rigorous to be effective. It was effective because it targeted a man who had already placed himself outside every network that might otherwise defend him. Longstreet had broken publicly with the Southern Democratic consensus. He had no political allies in the region, no informal protections from the community loyalty that shielded other former Confederate generals from sustained criticism. He could write letters and give interviews and contest the record in detail. And he did all of these things with considerable energy. None of it broke through the consensus Early was building, because the campaign against him was not fundamentally about the historical record. It was about what Longstreet represented, the most prominent former Confederate who had chosen to embody the political settlement that the Lost Cause movement existed to resist. Grant was inaugurated in March of 1869, and among his first significant appointments was James Longstreet as Surveyor of Customs for the Port of New Orleans. The position carried real federal authority, a real salary, and the formal institutional standing of a man returned to service of the government he had spent 4 years fighting against. The political symbolism moved in multiple directions simultaneously. It said something about Grant's understanding of reconciliation, about the seriousness with which he treated the terms of Appomattox, and about a personal loyalty to a man he had known for 20 years that his presidential authority now gave him the means to act on. Additional appointments followed. Grant named Longstreet United States Minister to Turkey, a diplomatic posting that carried the standing of a formal representative of the United States government abroad, a role that would have been politically inconceivable for a former Confederate general, without a president willing to personally stake his credibility on it. Grant staked his, absorbed the objections from his political opponents, and did not revise the appointment. The most severe test of what Grant's backing meant in practical terms came in New Orleans in September of 1874. The White League, a paramilitary organization committed to the violent removal of Louisiana's Republican Reconstruction government, staged an armed assault on Republican administration forces in the streets of the city. Longstreet, commanding the Louisiana State Militia and Metropolitan Police in defense of the Republican governor, was caught in the fighting, wounded in the engagement, and briefly taken prisoner by League forces before federal troops restored order. He had put himself physically between white paramilitary violence and a Republican state government, and the violence had found him. Grant responded by enforcing federal authority in Louisiana and making clear the government would not permit an armed insurrection against a state administration to stand without consequence. The political pressures on him during this period were intense from multiple directions. Northern Republican opinion was beginning to tire of the sustained costs of active Reconstruction, and Southern Democrats were pressing for federal disengagement with increasing effectiveness. Grant held the position anyway, for reasons that included both principle and something more personal. Longstreet's Memoirs appeared in 1896, 3 decades after Appomattox and 11 years after Grant had died of throat cancer in upstate New York, completing his own memoir in the weeks before his death with a discipline that people who witnessed it found almost impossible to adequately describe. Grant's personal memoirs had been published in July of 1885, 2 months after he died, and had immediately established themselves as something apart from the standard military memoirs, spare, direct, without self-pity, more interested in accuracy than in the impression the author made on the reader. Longstreet's book was different in character. It was longer, more argumentative in places, more willing to contest specific points of the record. The Gettysburg controversy ran through it with the persistence of something he could not put aside, and much of the critical reception focused on that dimension. But in the passages concerning Grant, the friendship before the war, the meeting at Appomattox, what the post-war years had produced between them, the quality of the writing shifted. Longstreet was not a man given to overt sentiment, and his memoirs generally had the controlled quality of a soldier's account. In the sections about Grant, something loosened. He wrote about the offer of money, about what Grant's behavior in the hours after the surrender had meant to a man in his position, about what the post-war appointments and protections had represented to someone the rest of his community had turned against. He wrote about these things with the specific care of a man who had thought about them for a long time and wanted the record to hold them accurately. Grant's own memoirs said almost nothing about Longstreet. They did not need to. The public record of his presidency, the appointments, the parole protections, the response to New Orleans had already said it in a language more durable than personal testimony. What Grant did at Appomattox and in the years that followed was not the automatic product of being in the position he occupied. The political environment of 1865 contained serious organized pressure for a different settlement for trials, for punishment at the senior levels of Confederate command, for a peace that extracted a visible accounting from the men who had led the rebellion. These were not frivolous arguments. The history of Reconstruction, which unfolded largely as the advocates of harder terms predicted it would, when leniency was the guiding principle, suggests that some of those concerns were well-founded. But Grant's approach was not wishful thinking about Southern loyalty. It was a judgment about how to close something that needed to be closed without producing the kind of prolonged resistance that harsh terms for surrendered commanders would almost certainly have extended. The calculation was not perfectly correct. Very few calculations about that period were. What it was genuine, made by someone who had fought through the war's worst campaigns, who understood better than most of the men debating in Washington what the fighting had actually cost, and who had decided that the goal of the peace was reunion rather than retribution, even when retribution had legitimate claims. Longstreet was the former Confederate who took that judgment most seriously and absorbed the largest personal cost for acting on it. He accepted Reconstruction not as a performance of compliance, but as a public and sustained commitment, voted for Grant, endorsed civil rights amendments, commanded Republican state forces, got shot for it. He did all of this knowing what it would cost inside the community he had come from, and the Lost Cause movement ensured it cost as much as it could arrange. What he held through all of it was the friendship which meant he held his own first-hand knowledge of who Grant was, formed across 20 years of actual shared experience, resistant to the narratives being built around him by men who had other purposes. Longstreet had been at Grant's wedding. He had been offered money by Grant on the afternoon the war ended. He had been appointed, protected, and defended by Grant through a decade of Reconstruction politics that would have finished him without that backing. The friendship was not a symbol or a historical lesson. It was built from specific events, and it endured because the man at its center had shown, repeatedly and at personal cost, that his word on the terms of Appomattox and his loyalty to the men he had called friends were the same thing. Longstreet died in 1904, at 83, having outlived the war, the most damaging phase of the Lost Cause campaign against him, Grant himself, and the Reconstruction he had staked his reputation on. What he had not outlived and the precision with which he recorded it in his memoir suggests he had no intention of allowing it to die before him, was the account of what had happened on the afternoon of April 9, 1865, when the cannon stopped firing across the Virginia countryside, and a man in a mud-stained coat came out of McLean's parlor, crossed the lines, and called him Pete.